John? My gosh,
I haven't seen you in 300 years.
Yes, I know.
I saw your name was on it.
No, it's good to see you. Afterwards, you can tell me what you're doing in real life now. You really want to?
I was listening to streaming the last part of the Carnegie thing last
Yeah.
night.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
You kept interviewing.
All right, let's do this. Thank you all for coming. I'm Michael Crapon, the co-founder of the Stimson Center. When Barry Bleckman and I were crazy enough to venture out and start a new think tank, we of course needed a name. And we thought about it a lot. And we landed on the name of Henry L. Stimson. For one reason is because we wanted people to remember that name. He was a bigwig, a New York Republican bigwig, who worked for every president, except one, between Taft and Truman. And he answered the call of FDR to come back into service because war clouds were already over Europe and they were headed our way. And FDR needed somebody to help him prepare the American people for the challenge to come. And that was a time when America Firstism was very pronounced in the Republican Party. And Stimson came into government along with the new Secretary of Navy, also an internationally minded Republican, to try and help make the challenges ahead more of a bipartisan affair. So we were drawn to that model at Stimson. We cling to this model, despite evidence to the contrary. And Stimson was, of course, very engaged on the nuclear issue. And that, too, has been a common thread throughout the Stimson Center's 3 decades. We're now 30 years old. Amazing. And we've had help covering this waterfront. 2 foundations in particular have been with us for 3 decades. The MacArthur Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And without them, I think it's fair to say we wouldn't be here now. And MacArthur is funding our present work, which brings us to today's panel. Questions about the nuclear future. What the heck do we do now? And we may not have bottomed out. And we really do need brainstorming sessions to think through this problem set. And we have 4 people who can help us with our brainstorming. And I'm grateful that they have agreed to come. Our first speaker is Linton Brooks, who is known, I bet, to every one of you. He's a senior advisor to us all. and not just to the nuclear labs. He was, as you probably know, the administrator of the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, in the Department of Energy. And Truth in Lending, NNSA also helps the Stimson Center with our work to reduce nuclear dangers in South Asia. Linton was the U.S. negotiator for the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. He has been with the U.S. Navy for 30 years before all of that. So we're happy to have him here. And we're happy to have Kristen Van Bruskard as well. And she's been hiding on the West Coast, so I thought it would be useful to bring her here. I've asked Linton to structure his remarks around if we had a president smart enough to ask you, where do we go from here? What would your answer be? And I've asked Kristen to answer the question of, where are the Russians in all this? And she can help us. She's a nuclear postdoc at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford. She is a Kremlinologist and a new generation of Kremlinology. She's been a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies, and she's been an advisor to the Norwegian Armed Forces. She holds a PhD from King's College, but she's no stranger to Washington. She did her graduate work here at Georgetown. Now, I've asked Brad to be our third speaker, Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Livermore. He spent almost 4 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy in the Obama administration. Prior to that, he spent a long time at the Institute for Defense Analyses, a graduate of Stanford, the London School of Economics, and my favorite, Erasmus University in Rotterdam, where my 10-year-old, eventually to be mother, got on a ship to come to the United States from Lithuania. And our fourth speaker, who I'm very grateful to host, is Heather Hurlburt. She's at the New America, where she is working on new models for policy change. I think that's the right set of words, frankly. What makes policy advocacy effective? I mean, that's a topic we need to hear from her about. Brad wrote a book, which I recommend, The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. Now I'm asking him to make the case for nuclear arms control in the 21st century, and I'm asking Heather to put this in a domestic political context. So it's a great panel. Linton, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Brad. You notice how when Brad describes me, he goes through all this experience. He never actually uses the word old, but you can draw your own conclusions. So we're in an alternate universe in which I get asked by the president what we should do to preserve the benefits of bilateral U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control. So here's what I would tell him. First, I would tell him to agree to extend New START for the full 5 years. I would say that would let us continue to get the transparency which leads to predictability and thus stability that is our chief advantage of New START, but also it gives us time to either figure out, as I do not believe is likely, a successor treaty, or figure out, as I do believe we need to do, how we live in a world in which we don't have any legally binding treaties on this subject. So that's the first thing I tell him. Second thing I tell him is that as part of that agreement with the Russians, to agree that both sides will direct the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the body that deals with the management of New START, to deal with Russian concerns about U.S. conversion practices, particularly on submarine-launched ballistic missile tubes, and U.S. desire to bring some of these exotic new weapon systems, the intercontinental nuclear-armed cruise missile, nuclear-powered cruise missile, a amazingly dumb idea, but it's there, or it's going to be there, and the so-called Status 6, the intercontinental range torpedo, bring them into the arms control regime somehow. There's a technical body. This needs to get out of Russian ambassadors talking about it at Carnegie and into technical experts talking to it, because these are both solvable problems. Third thing I'd tell him is stop talking about China. The task here is to preserve the bilateral arms control relationship with the Russian Federation. There's virtually no chance of Chinese participation. In my view, anybody who tells you we must take China into consideration is telling you, I don't want any agreement, but this is an acceptable way to pretend I do. The Chinese have made it very clear that until we reduce vastly more than I think we are likely to over the next couple of decades, they're not interested in getting involved. At most, we may, if we get to a follow-on negotiation, want the Chinese government to say what its experts say, which is that it has no intention of engaging in any kind of sprint to parity. But to bring China into formal negotiations is a formula for not getting anywhere. Fourth, I would tell the president to remember that the enemy is not nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are going to be here for decades. The enemy is nuclear war. The enemy is nuclear use. And because we vastly overestimate our ability to control escalation, that's universal. The United States, the Russian Federation, Chinese People's Republic, Pakistan, India. We overestimate our ability to control escalation. Preventing nuclear war means preventing conventional war between nuclear armed states. And I'll say a little bit more about the specifics of that in a minute. Fifth, I would tell the president to stop thinking of arms control as a synonym for legally binding, formally ratified treaties. Modern arms control theory goes back to Tom Schelling and Mort Halpern's 1961 book, Strategy in Arms Control. And they say, quote, we use the term arms control to mean all the forms of military cooperation between potential enemies. They include in that treaties. They include in that military-to-military discussions. They include in that sort of reciprocal unilateral discussions. And we need to revert to that concept. In particular, the president should seek the removal from this coming year's National Defense Authorization Act of the legal bar on military-to-military discussion with the Russian Federation. The experience with deconfliction in Syria has shown that even in a place where our broad objectives are quite different, the two militaries can work together professionally. And I will argue in a couple of minutes that if your object is to prevent nuclear war, getting more cooperation between the two militaries may be the best thing you can do. And sixth, I would tell the president to begin two serious blank sheet of paper interagency efforts not aimed at getting good talking points for a U.S. position, but aimed at really trying to solve two problems. First, how would the United States deal with the issues that Russia asserts have to be solved for there to be any follow-on negotiation? And what are our minimum requirements, particularly with regard to so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons, a horrible term that we use for lack of a better one, but which means essentially nuclear weapons that aren't covered by existing arms control agreements. And secondly, I would ask the President to start a serious look. Suppose there is no follow-on to New START, whether that happens in 2021 or whether it happens in 2026, and we are faced for the first time in half a century with a world in which there's no regulation between us. How do we mitigate the consequences of that? And I'll say a little bit more about those 2 points in a second. So that's why I tell the President. I want to expand on 3 of those points. The first is preventing nuclear war. Arms control has a very good record of preventing arms races and a fair record of preventing instability in terms of competing force structures, and no record at all in terms of actually doing something to prevent nuclear war. We prevent nuclear war through deterrence and through having a survivable second strike capability. That means nuclear war is literally irrational. And because we don't understand controlling escalation, conventional war ought to be too risky to concentrate. Now, deterrence works. But as Senator Nunn said last year at the Carnegie Conference, for those of you who were there, you can't deter a blunder. Regardless of what happens with New START, we need military-to-military discussions. We need them to involve both the currently active community, but also the retired military community. Why the retired military community? Because they are freer to be candid. There is a level in government at which you can't have a personal opinion, because nobody will believe it's personal. They will believe it's your government's position, so it needs to be your government's position. And what this military-to-military discussion should be is, if we did X, how would you react to that? The danger for both sides is that they will do something that they think is signaling restraint, and the other side thinks is signaling an intent to attack. I'll give you a U.S. example. If there's a Baltic crisis, we will roll a Stryker brigade out of Germany, and we will roll that baby right up into Poland, and we will say, look, we are prepared to defend our allies. And what the Russians will hear is, you're going to seize Kaliningrad. All right? So we will think we're showing restraint and resolve, and they will think that we're positioning for an attack. Some of what, at least I believe to be Russian intentions at the brink of war, are based on significant misunderstanding of how the United States will react. So we need the militaries to understand that, because the risk is that we blunder ourselves into war, that we ratchet ourselves up. If this sounds a lot like World War I, that's because it is. So we also need to look at other things that could be misinterpreted. For example, we should formally share what we think about orbital positioning of satellites that could crash into early warning satellites. Just say, if we saw your satellite here, this is how we would interpret it. So that, in time of great tension, You can't prevent somebody who decides they want to start a war, but deterrence ought to dissuade them of that. But you can, somebody who's positioning themselves in a way the other side will interpret as aggressive, you can prevent. We need that. We need a norm that says we're not going to mess around with nuclear command and control in the cyber world. And we need a channel for both space and cyber that we have previously formatted that gets genuine technical experts talking to each other in real time, by which I mean minutes, so that we can avoid misinterpretation of each other's side. So that's the first big takeaway of what we need. Second big takeaway is follow-on treaty. Now, I am, as some of you know, very skeptical about this, and I have a very long track record of being wrong. So maybe I'm wrong now. But here's the problems we face with a follow-on treaty. First, we may decide not to try. All right? Current position of the United States, that New START is pretty much the only obligation the Russians have taken that they're not violating. We think they're violating the CWC. Said that 3 days ago at the CD. We think they are violating INF. We think that they are violating open skies. We think that they are violating a whole series of political commitments. Now, whether that's right or not, it would not be irrational to conclude it's just not worth negotiating something new with these guys because they'll only keep it as long as it's convenient for them. So we may decide that they're not a reliable negotiating. But suppose we decide, well, we face some pretty serious problems in reaching agreement. The most obvious is national missile defense. Essentially, Russians see U.S. missile defense is aimed at them, and they want legally binding limits on it. Legally binding limits on national missile defense are politically impossible in the United States with this Senate or any other conceivable Senate. So, if one side says, I must have something, and the other side says this is the one thing you can't have, it's sort of hard to see how you compromise your way out of that. One of us is going to have to blink. Otherwise, new treaty is impossible. But suppose we get around that. Space forces. Russia has said for years that they believe that we will deploy space-based weapons capable of rapidly striking strategic targets and threatening strategic stability. Now, I think there are ways to assuage that. I don't think preventing an arms race in outer space, space control, I don't think any of those things are suitable subjects for arms control. But the narrow subject of attacks on the surface of the Earth from space, I think, can be dealt with. But we haven't thought about that at all internally, and like many things, it's way more complex than a single bumper sticker. Non-strategic nuclear forces. We have gotten ourselves, whether rightly or wrongly, in a situation where it will be politically very difficult for the United States to accept a treaty that doesn't deal somehow with non-strategic nuclear forces. The Russians thus far show publicly, privately, track 2, track 1, zero interest in even having a discussion on that, even acknowledging what they do and don't have. Conventional strategic forces. Every time you meet with the Russians, they talk to you about conventionally armed cruise missiles, particularly sea-launched, and their belief that this is a way for a destabilizing conventional strike. And every time they say that, the Americans come back and say the Russians are worried about prompt global strike, which is true, but not what they're talking about there. As far as I can tell, the government of the United States and the think tanks that support it have spent approximately 0 minutes even thinking about the problem. It may be that after you think about it, you'll come up with the answer, just say no. But at the moment, We are doing no thinking about that. So if that's really a Russian demand, it's hard to see how we succeed. Now, perhaps all these can be overcome. Historically, the Russians really don't like an unregulated balance because they know that if there were an arms race, we have the greater economy. Whether we have the greater will is a separate question, but we have the greater economy and we could win it. So maybe we can get around this, but the complexities to me suggest that a follow-on treaty is unlikely. So that leads to my final point. We need to begin discussing now how we can limit the damage to our political and strategic relations if New START expires and there is no replacement. My principal reason for wanting to see New START extended, in addition to some domestic support for the modernization program, is that I think it's going to take us more than 2 years to figure out how we deal with that. And I think next year is a lost year because, and I defer to somebody who is more expert than I, but I think next year is going to make the last election look like a civil Tea Party, and I think that's a bad time to try and solve hard intellectual problems. So, everybody in this room has either said or heard people say that arms control is not an end in itself. Arms control is a tool to ensure national security and international stability. So the first thing we should say is, if New START vanishes without replacement, what is it that we really lose? All right? So let me suggest a couple of things. We lose a substantial amount of transparency, which we either will have to learn to live with greater uncertainty or throw a lot more resources of the intelligence community, or some combination of both. Transparency leads to predictability and thus to stability. For Russia, bilateral arms control symbolizes the respect that the country thinks it deserves. This is pejorative, but not entirely inaccurate. Russia is Venezuela with atom bombs. What makes Russia important internationally is not its internal system. What makes Russia important international is its UN Security Council veto, the fact that it is the only country with major interests in the three major regions we worry about, Europe, the Middle East, and the Pacific. But above all, what makes Russia important is that they could destroy the United States as a functioning society during the time we have set aside for this meeting, and there's nothing we can do about it. So recognizing that fact is important to the Russian sense of their own national greatness, and equal treaties is a way that we have historically recognized that fact. Third reason that we might want something like New START is that it helps assert our compliance with Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore it helps us to preserve the non-proliferation regime. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I think that we get very little credit for retaining New START, but we get substantial blame for losing it. Both the United States and the Russian Federation, for different reasons, have a policy of maintaining rough strategic parity. We call ours second to none. We never write that down, but we've been observing second to none most of my professional life. It's way easier to do that if you have a legally binding or a formally established cap, because then you don't slowly ratchet up. I don't think that if New START vanishes, we're in a big arms race. I think we're in a slow arms race, but I think we'll be in an arms race. So we lose that. Now, and then finally, this is a U.S. thing. Just like arms control required a commitment to modernization, of the nuclear forces. I think nuclear modernization requires a commitment to arms control. And since I happen to believe that the nuclear modernization program is a good thing and helps preserve the peace, that's important. So for at least some of us, that maintaining what passes for consensus in today's environment on nuclear modernization requires doing something serious about arms control. So we need to sit down first internally and figure out what the advantage is, what we lose from New START, and then second, we need to have a discussion with the Russian Federation and come to some agreement about what is it that we jointly will lose. Then we ought to consider how can we mitigate the consequences. So, for example, we could continue to exchange all the data we exchange right now. It's entirely, we don't need a legally binding treaty to exchange data. We could even, although I think it is very unlikely the Russian Federation would agree to this, but under cooperative threat reduction, we reached a simple agreement for what were essentially inspections. So we could do that. We could have an informal agreement. Think the two presidents making their UN General Assembly speeches that neither of us would increase above New START deployed levels, provided the other showed comparable restraint. Verifiable by national technical means, sort of. So we could do that. We could show that we cooperate on the basis of equality and respect by intensifying cooperation under the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, which we co-chair, by a joint initiative to help states comply with UN Security Resolution 1540, which requires changes in domestic legislation, and by a serious initiative to revitalize negotiations on fissile material, which almost certainly means dealing with existing stocks, which will be complex, but would certainly show both that we're treating each other with respect and actually possibly do some good. On domestic support, we extend New START. We could ratify the protocols to the various nuclear weapons free zones in which there is no particular opposition. It's just nobody thinks that the administration is interested. And we could conduct some very serious strategic stability discussions with Russia along the lines I said earlier. Now, this is obviously rudimentary. More thinking and discussion and analysis is needed, but this problem is not going to be solved by ignoring it. Formal Russian-American strategic arms control is probably ending. By thinking through the consequences, we can minimize the harm to our relations and to international cooperation. And we ought to start that thinking now. Thank you, and after my colleagues have talked, I'll welcome your questions.
Excellent. Kristen.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I think we will find that Linton and I are in agreement on a number of issues. But I'll talk about what the end of arms control looks like from the Russian perspective. And the bottom line is that Moscow seems to be trying to save what may be left of arms control, including New START, which seems counterintuitive since most people perceive Russia as the main culprit of the current demise of the arms control regime because of their INF violation, primarily. So I'll touch on the several reasons why Russia may be interested in preserving elements of arms control. I'll say a bit about the apparent indicators that Russia is no longer interested in arms control and will not be in the future. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about the Russian calculus or Russian deliberations. So Putin's warnings of a new arms race, I think, are seriously conceived and express serious Russian concern. Russia has already been participating in what they perceive of as an arms race for a while, seeking to overcome a U.S. conventional hegemony of the kind that threatens Russian retaliatory capability, at least according to their logic. So on the Western side, we may express that ballistic missile defense has no capability to offset Russian strategic capabilities, but they evidently see this calculus differently and have been working hard to offset this with their new capabilities. Russia cannot afford a new arms race, and they know this, having learned the economic lesson from the Soviet demise. But they also seem compelled to compete asymmetrically in the nuclear domain and in other domains in order to overcome any U.S. superiority that can offset their retaliatory capability, which is what ensures their survival, according to their logic. A massive arms race and the demise of the entire arms control regime may inhibit this retaliatory capability and jeopardize their ability to ensure mutual vulnerability. Russia still expresses, actually, some interest in saving not the INF Treaty, but perhaps the remnants of the INF Treaty. There is a continued and unprecedented Russian campaign, information campaign, to try and convince the world community of their side of the story regarding the INF, seeking to communicate that Russia is not an irresponsible arms controller, that it can be trusted, and that it is interested in arms control. If Russia had no interest whatsoever in a future arms control regime, this communication effort would have been pointless. Russia also has an interest, evidently, in avoiding strategic surprise and in minimizing destabilizing incentives for nuclear preemption. This, of course, being the reason the Soviet Union agreed to the INF Treaty in the first place. The cost of such systems being deployed in Europe is still larger for Russia than it is for the US. A Russian land-based capability may threaten US allies and U.S. presence on Russia's periphery, as well as China. It will not threaten the U.S. homeland. But U.S. land-based systems in Europe threaten Russia and would threaten Russia now with more rapid attacks than during the Cold War. The prospect of a future U.S. deployment of such missiles in Europe may have changed the Russian calculus, and Russia continues to express now how it will not be the first to deploy such weapons in the European theater. Russia continues to communicate that they seek to preserve a new start, and Foreign Minister Lavrov has reiterated this message today, I think, at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, where he expressed that preserving New START is in the interest of Russia and in the interest of the international community. But he also expresses, as we heard here in Washington, D.C. last week as well, that continuation of New START would have to entail agreement regarding these Russian concerns about conversion of U.S. systems. A key issue for Russia seems to be that their concerns are taken seriously. And they express that this can be resolved in a variety of ways, including through cabinet-level written political commitments. But this new conditionality for preserving New START, as expressed also by the Russian ambassador last week, reflect what seems to be a deep disparity of perceptions. The U.S., of course, believes that Russia is now the party that has to display good faith in saving the New START treaty in light of its violation of the INF Treaty. So U.S. trust in Russian commitments to arms control treaties has to be reestablished. Moscow's perception, at least the one that Moscow communicates, is that the U.S. has consciously destroyed the INF and that the onus is now on the U.S. to reestablish its credibility as a state seriously committed to arms control. Although very few in the West are convinced by this logic, the U.S. administration's explicit hesitance in prolonging the treaty reinforces this perception. As Linton commented on, Russia has consistently expressed interest in potential limitations, or at least deliberations on military capabilities and technologies that they deem destabilizing. And the list of Russian concerns is long, and I think my list looks very similar to the one that Linton just described, which may be indicative of what potential Russian asks in any future arms control dialogue could include. It could include conventional precision strike capabilities. It would include missile defense capabilities, and in particular the particular geographic location of such capabilities, as well as system types. It would possibly include a dialogue on preventing an arms race in space. And this is also something that I saw Lavrov was commenting on at the Conference of Disarmament, a joint project with China in order to prevent the deployment of weapons in space. And it will include a dialogue on U.S. substrategic nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, which is the habitual Russian response when Western interlocutors raise the issue of the Russian substrategic nuclear arsenal. So the question then will be trading this for what, and whether symmetrical or asymmetrical agreements may be possible to achieve, because the list of U.S. grievances looks decidedly different from the Russian list of grievances. The U.S. list of grievances focuses primarily on Russian nuclear systems, including their new strategic systems, their dual-use systems, the general quantity and the utility of their large and growing substrategic nuclear weapons arsenal. And it also includes other concerns like Russian aerospace defense forces. But at least such lists of grievances can be used to generate discussion both internally, as Linton has indicated, and among the two sides to generate realistic dialogue about potential asks and potential concessions. And such arms control dialogue need not only to be about technology and capability that may prove destabilizing. It can also be, as Linton also alluded to, about political statements or commitments regarding the nature of war and escalation, regarding limitations on geographic deployments or system components, or regarding verification measures that could simply contribute to increased transparency and predictability. Arms control is about limiting the likelihood of conflict, and if the parties cannot agree on what capabilities are destabilizing, they may agree on what types of behavior is destabilizing. So what are the indicators that Russia is not interested at all in the future arms control? There are a couple of indicators. First of all, the decision evidently to develop a missile in breach of the INF Treaty. The Russian leadership must have reflected at some point on the possibility that their breach would lead to the demise of the entire treaty. They may have miscalculated the effect of their own actions in that they perhaps did not predict that the U.S. would go ahead and leave the treaty. But they must have reflected around the possibility after the U.S. started publicly accusing Russia of violating the treaty from 2014 onwards. There is the rapid pursuit of a host of new strategic Russian capabilities that are not covered by START, which could be perceived as a way of undermining or overcoming the treaty and the limitations it places on Russia. And there is, of course, as Linton also mentioned, the blatant and continued and sustained Russian disregard for a number of other treaties that places limitations on their behavior. A world without arms control, what does that look like from the Russian perspective? I would argue not too different from today's, at least that Russia has long lived with the U.S. withdrawal from the ABM treaty and pursued a range of systems to overcome this deficiency in the arms control regime from the Russian perspective. Does Russia need a strategic offensive nuclear arms arsenal that's larger than that dictated by START? I think there are competing discourses on that topic. Their nuclear modernization plans seem to be at least initially geared toward the caps that were dictated by New START. And their calculations of an ability to inflict unacceptable damage on an adversary are normally far below the numbers that are dictated by New START. Russian strategists now deliberate how also non-nuclear capabilities and sub-strategic nuclear capabilities may inflict unacceptable damage on some adversaries. And their options are now more wide-ranging than before, including through several of the new systems that can deliver certain retaliation. Russia would be in a situation where there were no limitations on strategic arms, would be more concerned with emerging technologies, although they are in a better place today than they were 10 years ago in terms of developing hypersonic capabilities, in terms of developing what they call weapons based on new physical principles. So in a way, you could argue that Russia is already preparing for a world without arms control. Still, they are likely to have severe and grave concerns regarding the future military competition, and you can see this from the kinds of statements they make about the impact of artificial intelligence, for example, on the future military competition. The demise of the New START or any other alternative arms control treaties would also likely trigger additional Russian concerns about U.S. nuclear capabilities, adding on the already existing Russian concerns about U.S. conventional capabilities. We need to know more about how Russia perceives of the utility of arms control in providing for its security in order to effectively determine how it will weigh the costs and benefits of future arms control. We need to know whether the value of arms control for Russia is in capping numbers that limit an unrestricted arms race, or whether the value is in capping certain capabilities that they deem particularly destabilizing. We need to know whether they value an arms control regime because it may reduce the risks of war, or whether they would value an arms control regime because it could potentially lock in any strategic advantage or as a way of curtailing U.S. aggression or advantage, or for that matter, Chinese aggression or advantage. Probably the Russian calculus may be a combination of the above, in part because in Russia, as in the U.S., arms control policy is an interagency bargaining process. And the process of the INF demise, I think, has illustrated some of the dynamics on the Russian side and raised a number of questions regarding this. For example, we've seen how the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has been the prime communicator regarding the Russian position and explaining what has happened, evidently using information that has been fed by them by the Russian military. And this raises questions regarding the insights of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs into what precisely has gone on in the process of developing these capabilities. It raises questions about the role of the Russian military industry and the role of the armed forces in the decision to move forward with prototyping the missile that breached the INF a decade ago, when some claim that a political decision was made around 2007-2008 to remain within the INF treaty, but missile development continued at the same time. So the question of who made these decisions and how this process took place evidently is important. So the future of New START and other arms control treaties, from the Russian perspective, I think will depend on the power balance between domestic actors like the Russian arms industry, the Russian general staff, and the military branches and their preferences, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the presidential administration, and all these actors' respective preference on the utility of strategic advantage versus an unchecked arms race, of the utility of arms control versus an unchecked arms race. So I'm mentioning all this just to make the point that there are a lot of unknowns with regard to the Russian strategic calculus about the utility of arms control. And finally, I'm mentioning all of this just to make the final point that the Russian calculus regarding strategic arms control is not only about what Putin wants, it is also about what Putin is told is within the realm of the possible and what he's told is conducive to preserving Russian national security. His statements of the past 6 to 12 months on this topic indicate that the advice he's currently receiving is also about the potential utility of preserving an arms control regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Roberts.
Dr. Crapon, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for the honorary degree.
Well earned. So you called this a brainstorming session. I've tried to approach my remarks in that spirit. I have a little bit of half-baked thinking to share. I hope that all of you will be gentle in probing the soft spots in the thinking. And there's the suspense for my remark. My point of departure is one of the segues in Linton's remarks about what is the problem we're trying to solve with arms control. And my sense of this is that we've had different answers to that question during the Cold War, during the late Cold War, the transition phase out of the Cold War, and since 1990. My sense is we've come to a big fork in the road. And let me make my case. The departure point in the 1990, was twofold. First, of course, obviously, the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the nuclear standoff. And the second main development was then, of course, the wake-up call to rogue state WMD, roughly in bumper sticker form, provided by Saddam Hussein and his occupation of Kuwait. And there was a complete reorientation of American strategic policy that every president since that moment has adhered to, by and large, with some important caveats and exceptions. But essentially, we've put the focus in the development of our strategic capabilities onto the problem of negating the deterrence of regional challengers. We've introduced missile defenses towards that end. We've talked about strategic non-nuclear strike towards that end. And we've composed our conventional forces to reinforce, or we've tried to reinforce that objective. At the same time, in the major power relationships, we put our focus not on deterrence, but each administration up to this point has used the term strategic stability as the guidepost of what we were trying to accomplish with Russia and China. And that we were moving away from something. Each administration articulated a little differently what we were moving away from. But roughly speaking, a nuclear standoff involving large numbers of nuclear weapons. And we were trying to use our nuclear relationships to improve these political relationships. And we were using arms control as a tool of that political objective. And that there were reductions that were offered was an important benefit to both the United States and Russia. But it wasn't, in my view, the primary focus of arms control. That from a grand strategy perspective, arms control was a part of transforming in a positive direction the relationships with Russia and China. And arms control played a supporting role. Well, 30 years later, this story hasn't worked out very well. And in my perception, during the second Obama term, we came to a series of dead ends, in fact, on almost this entire agenda. Let me just go down the list. From an Obama perspective, from reset, remember the button, to President Putin's speech explaining the annexation of Crimea in the context of an explicit charge that the European security order and the global order was about encircling and containing Russia and preventing its return, and a specific charge about arms control as a tool aimed at encirclement, containment, and weakness. From a U.S. policy perspective, we went from dialogue on strategic stability, the Strategic Posture Commission recommendation of a two-step dance, do something like New START, so that you would have a continuous arms control framework, but work towards a second follow-on agreement that would provide a more transformative quality to the strategic relationship. That was our focus in 2009 and 10 and 11. Where did we end up? Ash Carter standing up and saying we need a new playbook for Russia because it's now a real military problem again, and the resumption of military planning against Russia, which hadn't been in place since 1990. At the same time, we have Russia's adaptation of its deterrent and strategic posture for the new problem it felt it faced in Europe. And in case you missed Minister Shoigu's remarks late last week or early this week, he said Russia, the current armaments program will have increased the number of carriers of weapons deliverable against the West, land, sea, and air by a factor of 12, and the cruise missiles capable of delivery by those systems by a factor of 30. And all of those are dual-capable systems. This is a serious response to the assessment of the need to push back against the prevailing European security order. So that's not a very positive outcome to the pursuit of positive transformative relations with Russia. Positive transformative relationship with China. We sought to take the baby step of a dialogue on strategic stability with China with the hope that maybe at some point in the process of a few years of dialogue we would come to some mutual understanding that possibly the Chinese could say, we can't tell you how many nuclear weapons we have, but we have enough, at least for the time being in current and foreseeable circumstance. And where did we get with the Chinese on this? Well, the same place the Bush administration got, the same place the Clinton administration got. Nowhere. Both have adopted worst-case planning assumptions about the United States. Both President Xi and President Putin continue to talk about the American pursuit of absolute security, capital A, capital S. Both describe their fear of color revolutions that we're going to bring to them. Both are assembling the military postures that they attribute to us. Both talk about achieving all multi-domain dominance. And our approach from 1990 forwards was roughly laissez-faire to developments in the Russian and Chinese strategic postures that they considered necessary to maintain the credibility of their deterrence in their eyes in the light of the adaptations we were making for the rogue state problem. And Clinton, W. Bush, and Obama were all able to say, well, we don't really like all that modernization you're doing, but over to you. This isn't troubling to us because our relationship's moving in the positive direction. We can't say that we have a laissez-faire attitude towards a factor of 30 increase in nuclear-capable cruise missiles striking Western targets, for example. Fourth dead end is in the pursuit of confidence building and arms control measures with Russia and China. As we know, China considers arms control a trick, aimed at tricking it into an arms race so that we can outcompete it in the way we did the Soviets in the 1980s, quote unquote. And in Mr. Putin's terms in his speech in March of 2013, arms control is a tool of subjugation and calls for new rules or no rules. I'm reminded of an experience in a Track 1.5 dialogue with some Russian counterparts when we were unsuccessfully pursuing an agenda of possible new confidence-building measures. And one of the Russian participants said, why would it be in Russia's interest to build American confidence? You already have too much. Well, fifth dead end, the missile defense sweet spot. So we used to say, Linton famously said this and has been misquoted 1,000 times, that we've been pursuing a strategic posture large enough to negate the rogues, but not so large as to negate the strategic deterrence of the major powers, and there was a sweet spot there that we could find and keep. Well, when we faced the prospect of North Korea going to 100 nuclear-tipped missiles and a duplicative problem in Iran at some point in the future, where is that sweet spot exactly? China already doesn't see the sweet spot, and Russia's pretty convinced there isn't going to be a sweet spot for very long. That is going away, and technology is going to take it further away. Sixth, we've approached this problem of strategic competition through the separate silos of the nuclear silo, the missile defense topic, each of the different components. This isn't how Russia and China think about this problem. And I think our policies and strategies have not been sufficient to the task in front of us. So from my perspective, we came to a fork in the road. The basic way we've had of thinking about the role of arms control in a larger toolkit to manage the strategic problems in front of us, we came to a series of dead ends. And at that fork in the road, the new administration arrived, and like Yogi Berra, took a fork. They went a certain direction. And to a certain extent, there are some big departures in what they've set out, and another extent, much more continuity than we might have expected. But it's time to have, I think, a broader discussion, not a discussion of the individual pieces of the policy agenda of the Trump administration, but rather what should be the main contours of our overall approach to this strategic landscape. Only then can we get to the question of what can arms control do for us for the next 30 years. And very briefly, it seems to me you can fit together these pieces of this policy in different ways. And I think there are 5. One is you reprioritize the major power problem and strategic stability with the major powers, and you say we're going to accept mutual vulnerability with the rogue states. That sort of takes the missile defense topic out of the way. Secondly, you could continue to put the rogue state problem first and say, I really don't care. I've already gotten the worst out of Russia and China that I'm going to get. Dubious hypothesis, but this is a choice that I hear people articulate. Third choice, don't care about these distinctions between these different states anymore. I'm going for dominance. Russia can't really compete with us in the long term. China can, but they won't. We can stay ahead of the rogue states. Go for dominance. Fourth, go the other direction. Go for minimum deterrence. Don't make any distinction among nuclear armed states. Don't maintain the extended deterrence mission. Just go for minimum deterrence. All these problems wash away. All you have to worry about is the nuclear part. And the fifth, of course, and most likely alternative, is that we stick in gridlock land. And we see these problems as too complicated or too separate. We engage in the minimum necessary modernization to keep capabilities in place, and we don't really head in a new direction, and we don't find solutions to these problems. It's pretty clear that there are arms control options down each of these pathways, but they're radically different arms control options. So I've suggested that there's a possibility of starting our thinking from scratch, but of course we're not starting from scratch, we're starting from where we are. And I think Linton has set out the main pathways forward on the bilateral process. I would agree that the optimum outcome, New START extension leading to New START follow-on, is unlikely, I think was Linton's term. I'd say it's got 5% or less likelihood. New START extension, but no New START follow-on, that's probably got a higher degree of likelihood. A bad deal offer, what I would call a bad deal from Mr. Putin, to test whether or not the current American president is willing to make such a deal, because having a deal is important and having a deal that was different from the Obama one is important. I think that's more likely than the other two options. And least likely is that we are in a 5-year period going to find our way through to some new thinking about this. I want to bracket the discussion with two closing arguments, and one is that even if we get the best case highly unlikely, let's recognize that bilateral nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia encompasses a shrinking piece of the competitive space between Russia and the United States. And while it's a good I'd like to have, it's not a great good in the way if it leaves open competition in all of the other domains. And I think conversely, the collapse of the regime, while unwelcome and unhelpful in many ways, would be the final wake-up call that our community needs to move on to new ways of thinking about these things. And I liked the term that appeared in the National Defense Strategy referring to the strategic atrophy that has seized us for the last 20 years or so. And if there's a positive note to end on, it's that these mounting dead ends compel us and have compelled us. These discussions have begun again. And that's very heartening. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Heather, I heard the word gridlock. So on to you, and please come down off of the... Thank you. Go ahead, Heather.
So, gosh, we've heard a lot. I've learned a lot, which this is not an enviable moment to be the final speaker, because I know you all also have questions and discussions you want raised. So I'm going to end the same place Brad did with making some proposals about how we broaden out. There will be a note of optimism at the end, I promise. You can hang on to that. But primarily, I'm going to talk about how the role of nuclear policy has shifted in American policy thinking and politics. I'm going to start with a little commentary on treaties, although really, Linton, you've said it much more succinctly than I was going to. But we'll start, Michael, since you evoked it so fondly at the beginning, we'll start by talking a little bit about partisanship and bipartisanship. And the way of being that you evoked in your introduction and the kind of thinking that brought Stimson into being was one where for many of us of our generations, bipartisanship was a way of being, but it was also, and we really didn't recognize it, an ideology. And it was an ideology that rested on a certain set of shared beliefs that were far more important to its practitioners than party affiliation. And what we have failed, I think, to recognize is how many of the assumptions that nuclear arms control and U.S. nuclear policy rest on were housed in that kind of bipartisan home. And what I want to suggest to you is that bipartisan home is pretty much gone. And we sometimes don't notice how completely it's gone because of the amazing sigh all across the room. Sorry about that. Because of the amazing efforts of institutions like this one that have kept it going against such enormous odds. But the reason it's gone is there is no political constituency for it anymore. And that has to do with factors that really have very little to do with us and our field, and they mostly have to do with sorting in the United States and the change in the role of political parties in American life. So, the good news is it isn't our fault as a field. The bad news is that really means we can't do anything about it. And now there is plenty of bipartisan and cross-partisanship still to be found. Many of us in this room spend many of our days on it. But much like the discussion we've just had about arms control, bipartisanship is a tactic. It is a tactic to pursue a set of goals and core beliefs that its participants have, and they may not be the same goals, and they're almost certainly not the same core beliefs. So once you make that shift in your mind about what bipartisanship is, that really, as we'll see in a little bit later, really has to shift some of your assumptions around the core foundations of U.S. nuclear policy. Second, I'm going to repeat what Linton said because it's so important and it's so hard for all of us. There is zero chance of a treaty making its way through the Senate on these themes. If you want to get back to a treaty-driven world, you would need to mount a generation-shifting advocacy campaign that we haven't seen anything like this since the anti-nuclear movements of the 70s and 80s. In its sheer magnitude and in the sheer shift in both the relative prioritization of issues and the views of issues in the American body politic and our political elites. And I submit to you that's not happening. So therefore, no more treaties. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So then that leads us to a third question, which is what exactly is the role of nuclear policy in broader American national security thinking and its political expression in our decision-making bodies? And here, I think there are a number of assumptions we make which are tenuous at best. And the first one I want to point to really has a lot to do with U.S. signaling, and it came up, I think, very strongly in your comments about Russia, which is we tend to assume that everybody believes that the enemy is nuclear war, that everybody believes that the U.S. is coherently signaling in a particular set of ways. But if you, as I do, spend a lot of time on social media looking at the things that people in elected office and highly influential positions say, it's by no means clear that that is what the U.S. decision-making establishment as a unitary body believes anymore. And again, that's not very pleasant for many of us to contemplate, but it is absolutely true. And I was very struck by the Kaliningrad example, because you try to imagine the kind of crisis situation that you're talking about and the pressure on an American leader to say, we have moved our Stryker brigade into Poland, we have no interest in taking Kaliningrad. Now, you sit, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but sit and think to yourself about administration we have now, administrations we could have in future, and how politically difficult it would be to say there's nothing the Russians can do that would make us do that. Just think about that for a minute. And then, very much to your point, think about what that looks like from Moscow. And I think to your point about our adversaries mirroring the kind of systems they say that we're doing. And it's getting easier and easier if you want to put together a story about what U.S. beliefs are that match those actions. It's getting easier and easier to do it. And again, you can see the pendulum swinging all kinds of ways, but the national security commentariat, which is different from expertise, but commentariat, and people who can command votes, importantly, you cannot see that fragmentation ending anytime soon. And therefore, we're not talking about a 2-year problem or a 4-year problem. We're talking about the foreseeable future where there are significant numbers of influential people who say, we can win nuclear war, it's a good idea to prepare for one, we want to establish dominance, we want to, in the Russian phrase, have absolute security. That is now a feature, a strong feature of American political life. And to my second point, that you then have to start asking yourself, do these people actually believe in deterrence? And I know we're not supposed to talk about this, and I will get stares as I am getting fisheye from the rest of the panel, but if some significant part of your national security establishment or your political establishment doesn't believe in deterrence, do you have deterrence? That's a really ugly thought. And it's not one, I mean, I'm allowed to say that because I don't work in this field on a regular basis. But it's a very serious problem. And I want to be clear, in case I sound partisan, I don't think it's only a conservative issue. I think you have a big swath of the left that, if given the opportunity, would say deterrence is immoral and we shouldn't have it. So then, do you have deterrence anymore? And your adversaries can fairly question or debate this point, which, back to your point about bureaucratic politics, then emboldens factions in other societies that never much liked deterrence to start with. And so you have an enormous problem and a situation that is very different from the one that we are accustomed to thinking about and building our policies on. The next point I want to make is how our politics thinks about nuclear issues relating to other security issues. And I really appreciate, Brad, that you brought this up, because for years we used to complain, oh, nobody thinks about nuclear weapons, nobody even knows we still have them, nobody pays any attention. Well, be careful when you get what you wanted, right? Because we're going to have, over the next 2 years, in the context of the presidential campaign, I think we're going to have a discussion discussion about no first use. I think we're going to have a discussion about tactical nuclear weapons. But I'm not sure it's going to be a discussion that's going to be at all helpful to the kinds of policy frameworks that we've been talking about up here. And it's going to be a discussion that happens in the context of cyber, and in the context of information operations, and in the context of how much should the Europeans pay for their defense, or how much should the South Koreans pay for their defense, or should we do a deal with North Korea, all which is going to make the fragmented situation even more fragmented. But that is not a reality that can be wished away or ignored. A related point to that I would make, and I was very interested when you quoted the old Schelling Halpern definition. The word that immediately jumped out at me was all the forms of military cooperation between potential adversaries. And now how meaningful is that in a world where many, again, of our political decision makers now see the primary Russian threat to the U.S. in the form of information operations and cyber, or the primary Chinese threat to the U.S. in the form of economic operations that kind of filter from an economic threat to our communities to cyber and espionage threat to our military operations. How do you fit those issues, which it's almost impossible to imagine any American president being able to say, oh, I've made all this great arms control progress and I've got nothing to show on these other issues. So this comes back around, I think, Brad, to your point about how badly siloed we've gotten, and how that is really, it's impairing our ability to come up with policy options for this very non-optimal world that we see in front of us. And it's also really impairing the ability of the nuclear establishment to talk to the rest of the American political decision-making communities, who listen to this and kind of scratch their heads and say, well, that was interesting, but it doesn't actually connect with anything I'm worried about. And if I'm not on one of the strategic subcommittees, even if I'm in Congress, it doesn't connect with anything I'm hearing on a regular basis. Now, this is where my promised bit of optimism comes in, because I do think this field, as compared to many other national security subfields, actually has a really amazing next generation of talent. That much more so than other fields, you have a community of young people who are organized, who think of themselves as having an identity of working on nuclear issues, who talk to each other, who use contemporary social media tools to a truly terrifying degree, and who I think are actually more than up to this challenge. And so the way I want to close this conversation, having perhaps thoroughly depressed you by telling you that the political system is completely not up to even the kinds of small bore optimism that we've heard, by saying that the nuclear community is going to have to change pretty dramatically. And it's going to have to change, I really, Brad, your metaphor of silos and broadening. And it's going to have to change in terms of what we think of as a legitimate nuclear issue, who we think of as a legitimate nuclear expert, and how we think you get in the room to have these conversations. So, as an example, I would love to see this START conversation going on together with the what do we do about cyber and what do we do about information operations. And I know that the hassles of everyone who spent years saying it's not the same thing as cyber. Stop saying it's all the same thing. But if we want these issues to get back to where you can imagine, you can't imagine an American president being willing to devote the amount of political credibility that Obama did on New START anytime soon. And as we know, that was a very touch and go thing, and I don't know if you have the same scars I do from when they almost decided to pull the treaty and not go ahead and try to ratify it. That was very touch and go, and it'd be much worse now. Even the kinds of I was very struck by the idea you could have an exchange of letters at cabinet level. Well, geez, you imagine a Secretary of State who thinks he or she is going to be president one day. Is he or she going to be willing to put their name on a letter like that? If you want to be able to get arms control issues back to the point where you can imagine an administration of either party being willing to make that level of commitment, you're going to have to reintegrate it with other parts of the security community, and you're going to have to change who's sitting in it, which brings us to the diversity question, where, as I said, you have young people from a variety of backgrounds actually beating down your doors to work in this field. And I know many of us see those issues as a distraction, but for all the reasons I've laid out, I hope that they are rather actually central. Those are the folks who can move these issues into places where they can have priority again.
Thank you, Heather. These have been very rich presentations, but we have shortchanged our audience. So let's have 3 quick comments and pointed questions that we can throw at the panel. And Ambassador Tom Graham, who knows a thing or two about the subject matter, why don't you go first with that microphone?
These will just be comments, and given the time, I completely agree with the last speaker of the importance of cyber. I think it should be right on an equal level with nuclear. It's where the conflict is today. There's a low-grade war going on among countries over cyber. And the Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, advised President Trump that if cyber gets to a certain level, nuclear weapons are the appropriate answer. And so there's a direct link between cyber and nuclear. And so, therefore, I don't think you can have a complete discussion of nuclear weapons without cyber. Second, somebody's got to think about how climate change will change our ideas about national security. It may focus more on food, on access to food, water, and things like that as water sources disappear and arable lands disappear and deserts expand. So that's important too.
Thank you, Tom. I'm looking for a pointed question. The gentleman in the turtleneck, and then my good friend from the NRDC.
Several of the panelists have commented on a lack of political will in the United States to move forward with arms control. And yet, I wonder if any member of the panel could comment on the fact that, notwithstanding that assertion, there are probably very few things that Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Cortez, and Rand Paul would agree on, other than that it is not America's duty to spend all of its money defending Germany. And thus we have a counter trend that's obvious in the political narrative in the United States, which is moving away from confrontation. At the same time, the panel is commenting on the fact that moving towards confrontation or being confrontationalist is a dominant political trend. So how do these two trends coexist, and is there a way forward between them?
Tom Corcoran. Get yourself a microphone, Tom.
I thought the presentations were very impressive. But I have a question, and that is, no one spoke about leadership. And I recall Gorbachev came into office and really, in terms of nuclear weapons, changed the agenda. And we lost that after he left office, beginning in the mid-90s. And I would be interested in your observations of whether we're going to have to sit back and wait for another world leader in order to really make some changes.
It's a great question. Very quickly, because I want to do another round. Heather, why don't you go first?
Sure. I actually think you're wrong. In the list of individuals you named off, I actually think there's at least one, if you look carefully, who is actually not at all interested in seeing the U.S. change its relationship with Germany, although he's very careful not to advertise that fact. So I think that's partly, it's a question of intensity of preferences. That's how the two things coexist.
Leadership, leadership on this, I'd rather be in a wait-and-see mode. In other words, I don't know who would know where to lead at the moment, because we haven't done much thinking about the new landscape. So it's one thing to have the political will at the top, and it's another thing to have the supporting strategy that can be implemented if the will exists. And my argument is the strategy we're pursuing is kind of in disarray because the world has moved on. I'd rather see us use this period of uncertain political commitment to do the homework we need to do to make a series of very clear and concise recommendations that someone can seize.
Kristen, you can get a pass on this one, or you could tell us, how does the question of leadership present itself from long distance? U.S. leadership.
That's a tough one. I was planning on answering another much easier question about current Russian leadership.
You can do that too. I don't want to put you in a hard place.
Yeah, I think I will choose to respond to regarding the potential Russian leadership. At least the comment on Gorbachev made me think about the sort of the ideological conviction that in part informed, ideological in terms of a conviction regarding the massive destruction of a nuclear confrontation, and how that informed Gorbachev's thinking regarding the need for dramatic reductions in nuclear arms versus the much more transactional approach that I think is evident from the current Russian leadership. So I think that it would take at least one, if not several, generational shifts on the Russian side as well before you would see the type of leadership that Gorbachev and to some extent also Reagan exhibited in this domain.
Contrary to my presentation, I do see all glasses as half full. So let me give you a couple of half-full responses. First, Tom, I'm just stunned by your comments. I can't think of a conversation I've been in with the nuclear experts that doesn't deal with cyber. The idea that we are not seized with that is wrong. We are grasping with it because it's hard, but it is a dominant issue for a variety of things. Secondly, I'm going to push back on one of my panelists a little bit. It is possible to conceive of a ratified treaty, but it has to be negotiated by a Republican president. There are 4 Republicans left who voted for New START, and I don't know whether any of them would vote for it again. Historically, Democrats all vote for arms control because they like it, and Republicans vote for it when it's their guy. So that means you need a dominant Republican president. It's unclear whether the current president wants to make a deal. He likes making deals. So if it is not out of the question that we have some kind of leadership pairing on the Russian side for all the reasons Kristen said why they don't want a domination, and on the U.S. side for the same reason that this is the only president who's actually seriously tried to do something with North Korea. Almost certainly going to fail, but you know, trying harder than others. So there's at least a possibility that we can see something, which makes it even more important that we figure out what we want that something to be and how we deal with the speed bumps to it. On the fundamental question of leadership, yeah, I mean, leadership matters, but you can't lead an intellectual movement if you don't have some ideas. That was Brad's whole point. And we are still in some disarray internally on what problem we're solving.
Are there any other really pointed, short questions?
And one to the right.
Okay, this gentleman in that corner, the gentleman in this corner, please.
Based on your concerns about getting bipartisan support for a treaty, could we do something like PSI, Proliferation Security Initiative, to make and keep positive step forward without having nations formally having to recognize it?
Thank you. Sir, wait for that microphone. There it comes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will argue that one of the primary reasons why we were able to defeat the Soviets during the Cold War is because of our economic policy and our agenda to outspend them. Dr. Roberts mentioned since 1990, we made a move to build in strategic arms strategies in this new world, and we've kind of strayed away from those economic, those soft powers. In you guys' experience, what do you think an economic solution to this arms power, or what would the Russians want economically in order to resolve this issue?
Thank you. I'm going to stop it there and give everybody on this side a very short response. Linton, go ahead.
Economics matters. If there is to be any kind of agreement, it has to look like something like Jim Timby argues, looking a lot more like, don't tell a Republican I said this, the JCPOA, because that kind of series of cross-domain specific, some national, some international things, except with much more effort than went into getting support for that. And I had an answer to your comment, but I forgot.
Kristen.
I think that, as I mentioned, I think that the inducements or the incentives for Russia not to get into an unconstrained arms race are precisely economic. I mean, they stem from this economic realization that they will lose that game. But having said that, I think that the notion that economics will significantly restrain Russia's ability to sustain its capability for retaliation, I think that may be misconceived, at least in the world we are living in now, when we see that despite a dire economic situation, Russia continues to spend on these systems because they are essential to Russian survival.
I want to just address the economic topic, but from a different perspective, and to offer a different way of thinking about the impact of the economic calculus on Russian choice for arms control. It's the traditional calculus is the one Linton articulated, that they are concerned about our ability to outcompete them because we've maintained upload capability in our force and because we have a superior underlying economy. Practically, they've solved the upload imbalance problem in the force they've built. They must calculate correctly that ours is going to go down over the next 15 years. And if you were Mr. Putin betting on America's economic and political future, would you think an arms race is in our future in the next decade? No. We're going to debate doing less in the way of nuclear modernization, not more. We have a political problem that's not going to be solved in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. So it seems to me there's a reverse on the usual calculus. Yes, we may have the superior economic potential, but we can't tap that potential for budgetary and political reasons. So it seems to me to reverse the traditional calculus.
Heather.
So 2 quick points. To your point, I would suggest another model, and Linton, it's even worse for Republicans than JCPOA, if that's possible, and that is a Paris Climate Accord model, where you are making national commitments. Maybe you're going home and ratifying them, maybe you're not. That provides you some transparency, some mode for verification and holding accountable. You save some of the things that you liked out of the bilateral arms control enterprise, but God forbid you ever call it that. And to that point, I really hope you're right. But Michael, if you're game, if this administration is able to negotiate and get through the Senate any kind of extension or follow-on to New START in the next 2 years, how about we have a party here and Numerica will split the cost of it with you.
There you go.
You're on, Heather.
Don't have to get it through the Senate to extend.
I'm calling this wonderful, thought-provoking session to an end, and I'm going to provide the optimism. Because I want everybody here, and only few of us actually lived through it. But if we think back to the early 60s, that was the last time when we were working from a blank sheet of paper, so to speak. We knew that general and complete disarmament wasn't going to work, although we keep vocalizing it. And a group of very smart people came together, and they conceived of something called arms control, nuclear arms control. And think about, if you can, how hard it was to make that work. Think about where the U.S. and the Soviet Union was. Think about Berlin. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Think about a country that absolutely would not tell us what it was doing. Wouldn't give us numbers. We had to provide the numbers. When we started, would never think of on-site inspections. We were poles apart. We were blocks apart. And somehow, through the hard work of two previous generations, this extraordinary set of accomplishments was reached.
By a lot of young people and people who a generation earlier weren't allowed to be in the American system, by the way, whether it was John Kennedy, whether it was the admission of Jews or women to public life. So who are the people who are going to do that for us now?
Actually, we have those people.
Yes.
I spend a lot of my time working with the next generation, and they are so much better than we were.
I'm
serious. If you want to be optimistic, spend time with people under 40.
I'm running this show.
Not very credible.
See, you start with optimism, and we're all bursting with optimism.
You're losing it.
There's amazing talent. There's amazing talent out there. Amazing talent. I think it's going to be done differently this time around. It won't be the Charles River Gang. But I think if we retreat into pessimism, it won't get done. That I'm sure of. So I think the task before us, as has been clarified, is to go back to first principles. What do we want? What do we call it? And we have a lot of brainstorming to do, more of it. Thank you for coming. Thank you, panel.
Hi, Bob. Yeah, good to see you.
Everybody did, but it
mentioning climate change, and shame on me for not mentioning it. I very much appreciate it.
Sure, thank you.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. Hi.
My name is Tuna Shalmi from Turkish Radio Television.
Oh, yeah.
How are you?
Yeah, good.
Thank you for that beautiful conversation. Can I have your card?
You can have my card if you wait till I walk across the room where my things are. Give me a second. I need to ask. First of all, I need to give back this thing because I'm now browsing.
We are preparing a special session.